Welcome to our adult forum today. Glad that you are here. Glad that you are with us. Welcome. It's a crazy Sunday at St. Paul's, the first Sunday with people in the pews in exactly a year. So everything's a little unusual. We're starting a little late, and we will have to finish earlier than normal, which is to say on time, because there is an 11 o'clock service. But if you're watching the YouTube stream, we're glad that you're here. If you're a participant in the Zoom webinar, again, glad that you are here. If you're on the YouTube stream, you are welcome to join in the discussion using the link found in the discussion. In the chat, I've included that link, which will take you to our website. And from there, you can find the link to the Zoom webinar. The Zoom webinar is where you can share your questions or your comments. But I'm glad that we are together. Let's move right into our work and enjoy what the text has to say to us. And we're going to finish around 10 till 11 in order to make time for the next service. But let's start with a prayer. Let us pray. God, you are with us even when we are apart. Draw us nearer to you, that as we come nearer to you, we might feel and know that we are nearer to one another. May your grace and your spirit guide us in this time and every day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So this is a series on only Mark. I'm looking at the peculiarities of Mark's gospel account. And this is the third week in a series. And let me remind you that the first week we looked at the wilderness scene. Mark gives us a very different take on the wilderness, a very short experience of Jesus's temptation in the wilderness. In fact, to say temptation might miss the point at all. The temptation's only like a passing line, unlike Matthew and Luke, which tell the whole complicated story about the different temptations. But we leave Mark, I think, sensing that there's a great cosmic battle taking place. And that fills the whole of Jesus's life, according to Mark. Last week, we looked at miracles. Mark tells the miracle stories in a different way. He tells fewer of them. And when he tells them in vivid detail, which in some ways tells us a little bit more about Mark. Maybe Mark had access to a firsthand account. The tradition tells us that Peter is the one who told Mark what he had seen. And indeed, Mark's story has an oral quality to it, as if he were writing down the anecdotes that he had heard from a preacher like Peter. So that holds up. But also, I'm fascinated to know what that tells us about how Mark understood Jesus and how Mark understood the gospel. And we saw a couple of elements of those miracle stories that not only are they vivid in detail, but Mark seems to be pushing a different, a fuller, a more complicated, a richer agenda. Mark wants us to encounter not only the narrative of the story, which Matthew and Luke often include, but also the theological meaning. Mark wants to draw us more deeply into that sense, what's going on behind the script. So that's what we looked at. But last week we noticed the topic, or today's week, someone, I think it was Evelyn Elledge, remarked that when we were reading one of the miracle stories, she shared that the secret, why did Jesus ask those who had been healed to keep it a secret? And that's our focus for today. One of the peculiar characteristics about Mark's gospel account is the secret. The fact that Jesus so often orders those who have seen his full power, orders them to keep it a secret. We're going to talk about that secret in detail today. Glad you're with us. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, come over to the Zoom webinar. You can find that link in the chat. And if you're on the Zoom webinar, the Q&A feature is the best way to share with me your questions and comments. But let's dig into the text. I'm going to share my screen. And you should still be able to see me as we look at the text. And I've got several different stories that I want us to hear and think about, some of which we'll be able to study in depth, and some of which we'll only be able to hear bits and pieces of. But if you've got notes, or if you've got your own Bible, put a little sticky note or stick something in, a bookmark in that space, and come back to it and let the story sink in a little more deeply than we have time to even in this time together. But I want to start at the beginning of Mark chapter 1. And I want to hear really two different miracles and how they're held up together and how they're similar and how they're different. Often when two stories are found right next to each other, They are intended to kind of have a conversation with each other, a conversation that maybe we can hear, kind of like art. If you hang two paintings on opposite sides of a room, or maybe even next to each other, sometimes there's a conversation going on between those two, like the very first and second paintings that you see at Crystal Bridges. There's a conversation going on about woman and identity and harvest in that first room at Crystal Bridges. So let's hear some of that conversation in the text that we have here. If you've got a question or comment, by all means, share it in the Q&A feed. But let me read Mark chapter 1. I'm going to start at verse 21, and then I'm going to read 1 through 45. I might skip over the middle paragraphs, but remind you of them. They, is Jesus and the disciples, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and was teaching. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, and not as the scribes. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent, and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. Let me pause there. That's the first miracle story, the casting out of the demon. Notice the next three paragraphs. Jesus goes to the house of Simon and Andrew, heals Simon's mother-in-law. Then at evening, the whole people in the town brought him all these other people who were sick. And then early the next morning, Jesus goes off by himself to pray, and then they head off to the next town. So that little intervening sandwich of alone in the house with disciples, huge crowd brought to the door, alone by himself in the wilderness. Let's skip that and read the second part that I want to draw our attention to, starting in verse 40. Now, and a leper came to Jesus, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. All right, those of you on the call, what do you notice? What do you notice in that? What do you notice, particularly as we compare and contrast the two stories on either end of this chapter? First, the unclean spirit, and second, the leper. Let me offer some observations, but I hope you'll share your questions or your comments in the Q&A feature. Notice that in the first part of the story, notice what the demon or the demon-possessed person said to Jesus. Verse 24, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." In Mark's gospel account, for the first 8 chapters, before Peter recognizes who Jesus really is, the only things that put the pieces together and identify Jesus as more than just a rabbi or a teacher are the demons. There's something about the spirits from the other world who recognize Jesus for who he is, the Holy One of God. Jesus' response to this demon is what? Be silent. Jesus doesn't use the word secret, tell no one, but he does command the evil spirit to be silent. So there's an element of what I'm going to call secrecy, but an element of silencing there. And then notice also at the end that as soon as the congregation in the synagogue saw it, Jesus' fame spread everywhere. Everybody wants to get a piece of this Jesus. Then, after the intervening bit, we get another miracle as Jesus begins to expand his ministry beyond Capernaum. This time it's a leper. The leper is healed, and notice what Jesus says to him. Jesus sternly charged him And he said, see that you say nothing to anyone. That's the silence. Don't tell anybody about this, but of course, go show yourself to the priest and offer the offering so that you can be readmitted to society. That showing yourself to the priest and offering the sacrifice was a way that the leper would be readmitted into society, even to his own family. But notice the tension there, that say nothing to anyone. However, despite charging him sternly to say nothing to anyone, what does he do? But he goes out, and I love Mark's phrase there. He began to talk freely about it, without restraint, without limit, to freely talk about it. The same way that we would say, don't talk so freely about this secret that shouldn't be widely shared. It's not public knowledge yet. And yet this leper who was clean doesn't just go and show himself to the priest, but he speaks freely about it. And there are consequences to that, right? The consequences to this growing fame is that Jesus can no longer openly enter a town. He can't ride into the town square. He has to live on the outskirts. If he goes into a community, everyone will come and flood him or crowd him, and he won't be able to get anything done other than all day and all night healing. I wonder what that tells us about secret. Take my word for it. We're going to look at several other examples where Jesus orders or urges secrecy or reticence. And I wonder how these two stories next to each other, how they inform each other and in a conversation inform us about what's going on with this secrecy. Share your thoughts, share your questions with me by all means. But let me offer, each time we look at a story, I'm going to offer a different hypothesis. The question that I'm trying to answer, or pretending to try to answer, is why would Jesus require secrecy? Why would Jesus tell people to keep this stuff to themselves, to not tell it openly? And each time we look at a story, I'm going to offer a different hypothesis. This time, I'm going to suggest that in part, this order to be quiet is so that Jesus's ministry can be manageable, right? Notice that in this intervening bit, we get that the whole city comes to the door. Everybody's got sick or demon-possessed people over and over again. Notice again that we see at the end of this verse that we didn't read, Jesus wouldn't permit the demons to speak because they knew him. So there's something about this keeping a low profile. He gets up early in the morning and goes to a desolate place because he's exhausted, because he needs to be renewed, or maybe it's because he needs to figure out what this next chapter of ministry is, but it requires some inward work, not just some outward work. And as we see, Jesus is stuck in these desert places. He can't have ministry in a city center because it's overwhelming. So maybe one hypothesis is that the reason Jesus is keeping a secret is because he needs to have some control over how his ministry unfolds. Robin, thank you for suggesting Jesus had a set plan and had to fulfill scriptures. Yeah, absolutely. There's a sense in which Jesus's timeline and the community's timeline aren't quite in sync, and Jesus kind of holding back. It's always bad biblical scholarship to integrate one gospel account to another. So we shouldn't hold up John to inform us about Mark. But you might remember in the first miracle at the wedding in Cana, when Jesus says to his mother, "My time has not yet come," and Mary says, "Oh, yes, it has. Stewards, do whatever he tells you to do." So there's a sense of timing and fulfillment. Absolutely, that has to happen. But what I want to suggest, one possible hypothesis, is that Jesus needed to be in control of how his ministry would go. And so as a result, he had to kind of keep a low profile. For example, if we had a really, really famous tippy speaker come, the kind of the headliner that people would actually start to knock on this person's hotel room door or show up wherever we were having dinner, we might have to sort of check that person in under a false identity. Imagine that, or eat in sort of some quieter, out of the way places, because otherwise we might not be able to be productive in that visit. So I wonder if part of that is what Jesus is up to. Let me show you this one. We're not going to read Mark 4, but put a bookmark in Mark 4 and go back and read it, the whole chapter. It's a brilliant chapter, and it tells us so much about secret. The word secret even shows up twice in this chapter. The only place that, well, that's not quite true. One of the only places in Mark where the word secret shows up. So we're just going to skim it for now. Jesus teaches parables, right? The parable of the sower, right? You remember this parable? Some seed fell along the path, some fell on rocky ground, some sprang up, and because it didn't have roots, some fell among thorns, and some bore fruit. Right? You remember that parable, right? But what I want to draw your attention to is, in particular, what Jesus' response to the parables are. Notice verse 10 and 11. When Jesus was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. Why are you talking in parables? And Jesus said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything is in parables, so that, quoting from Isaiah, they may indeed see but not perceive, hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. So Jesus is going to tell parables, and Mark gives us in chapter 4 a sense in which the parables are another layer of secret. But this time, what we see is that the secret, the truth, is to be revealed to some people, but kept from others. And in particular, the disciples are going to get the secret of the kingdom of God, but those on the outside of the disciples' community are stuck grappling with parables. There's some more explanation here, and then he offers this. Notice this is an important bit about secret. Nothing is hidden except to be made manifest, nor is anything secret except to come to light. So it's worth noting that in the midst of this conversation about secrecy, Jesus also tells a parable about the light, and you don't put it under a bed or under a basket, but you put it on a stand. Why? Because nothing is hidden except because it should be known. Nothing is secret except to come to light. And so there's a sense that although there is something secret going on here, the purpose of a secret is so that it will get out and so that it will spread. Jesus offers two more parables about the kingdom of God. Seeds scatter on the ground that sprouts, even though the farmer doesn't really know how it sprouts. Likewise, a grain of mustard seed, which springs into a large bush. So two other parables about the kingdom of God, starting small like a seed and then kind of springing forth. And on the note of parables in secret, note what we say here at the end. With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. Jesus didn't speak to them without a parable, but privately, he spoke to his disciples, explaining everything. So again, parables become another layer of secret. Typically, I think of the messianic secret being surrounded, pivoting around the miracle stories. Whenever Jesus heals somebody, he says, don't tell anybody about this. But here we see that parables also add a layer of secret. And the hypothesis that I would offer here is that maybe one of the reasons Jesus emphasizes the role of secret is because secret knowledge is salvation. That's Gnosticism. Gnosis is the Greek word for wisdom. Gnostic gospel is a gospel account that focuses on this gnosis or wisdom. And the theory, one of the theories in the early church that was condemned as a heresy, is that salvation is given to those who have this secret knowledge. We don't believe that, but you can find Gnostic elements in the gospel accounts, especially in Mark, probably the earliest gospel account, where we get this kind of secret knowledge, the ins and the outs, again, defining who's in the community, who's outside of the community. What does it mean to belong to Jesus? This image helps us understand how salvation works. Perhaps it's by knowledge that's given. I don't want to push that too far because eventually we get to Gnosticism, which is not a Christian faith. If you've got questions or comments, by all means, share them. What do you know about Gnosticism? I do think the church has long been afraid of Gnosticism, appropriately as a heresy, but we've been so afraid of it that we forget about wisdom and the role of wisdom and knowledge in salvation. Gnosis is important, knowledge is important, but it's not some secret knowledge that we only tell the insiders. It's a knowledge that might start as a secret, but as Jesus says, is going to come to light. All right, I want to skip over to Mark chapter 5. We're not going to read the second half, but we are going to read the first half of the story. And I want you to hear this miracle. This is another curing of a demoniac, but there's some differences to Mark chapter 5. We're going to read two stories, and we're going to skip around in the second one. But the first story is about the healing of a demon-possessed man in the country of the Gerasenes. And the second is one that we read last week, the story of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and his daughter. But let's start with Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 1. They is Jesus and the disciples. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. Those are the kind of details that Mark includes that Matthew and Luke don't bother. When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." So there we go. We've got demon recognizes who Jesus really is. For Jesus was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Fascinating. Let's keep going. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and the country. So people are telling. People came to see what it was that had happened, and they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. There is no secret there. Isn't that interesting? No secret. The opposite. Jesus says, "Go tell everybody what the Lord has done to you." Isn't that interesting? Why no secret this time? What was different about this man? This man who wanted to be a disciple of Jesus, but Jesus says, "No, you may not follow me, but go tell your friends and your family how much God has done for you." Why? Why is that different? Share your thoughts on the Q&A by all means. But let me scroll down. We're not going to read it, but you remember we read this last week. You remember that Jairus comes and says, "My daughter is near the point of death. Come and heal her." And on the way, there was a woman who had a discharge of blood that came and touched him, right? While he was speaking, someone from Jairus' house came and said, "The daughter is dead," right? Why trouble the teacher? Jesus goes and, of course, raises the girl from the dead. But the part I wanted to show you is the last verse. And he strictly, this is, when Jesus comes into the house, he puts everybody outside of the house except for the parents and Peter, James, and John, the triumvirate of disciples, and they go into the house. And then after the girl is raised from the dead, verse 43, Jesus strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give something to eat. Why the difference? Why the difference? Why is Jesus willing for the Gerasene demoniac to tell all your friends and family how much the Lord has done for you? But when it comes to Jairus, the synagogue leader, don't tell anybody. Don't let anybody know what happened. I would rather them not know that I raised the dead. What an odd strategy. I wonder what that's about. The hypothesis that I want to suggest, and all of these are hypotheses, I don't suggest that any of them is the right answer. But notice in the first miracle in chapter 5, that is taking place in a Gentile area. You don't have to be a geographer to know that the country of the Gerasenes is a Gentile area. All you need to know is that there's a herd of pigs on the hillside. Of course, pigs are not kosher. They're unclean. They're not allowed not only to be eaten, but they're not allowed in a Jewish community. So we know right away. Also notice that the demon calls Jesus the Son of the Most High God. Most High God, capital M, capital H, capital G, is a euphemism for the Gentile name for Israel's God. Go read Daniel, if you go read Daniel, you'll see often Most High God. Go read Esther. When Ahasuerus identifies Esther's God, it's the Most High God. This is what Gentiles call Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Israel. So we see a Gentile area here, a Gentile man, legion, Roman military name. So this is very much a Roman Gentile event, the Decapolis Gentile area. This, of course, in the second half is Jairus, the synagogue's ruler, as Jewish as they come. So there's a difference here. And I think part of the reason that Jesus was happy for the word to spread among the Gentile community, but not among the Jewish community, is because the conflict that Jesus will face is not, at least as the gospel accounts tell us, a Gentile conflict. It's a Jewish conflict. It's the conflict between the Jewish authorities and Jesus that ultimately leads to his arrest and execution. So I wonder if part of the reason Jesus tells most people to keep this a secret is because he needs to avoid that conflict until he's ready, until he goes to Jerusalem. Otherwise, as Robin notes for us, otherwise the conflict might come to a head and Jesus might be killed before he's able to fulfill all of the scriptures, all of the purpose of his ministry. So again, part of that is about timing. Again, share your thoughts, share your input with me. I'd love to hear from you about that. I'm going to read, we've got 3 more stories. That's a lot. So we're going to keep going, but do share your comments. We'll go back, share your comments as they come to you. Don't wait for me to ask, share your comments or your question. So this is from Mark 7, a shorter story. This is one that we read last week when we looked at the miracles. I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but I want you to notice again what I think Evelyn pointed out to us last week, is that when Jesus goes to heal someone with a speech impediment and who's deaf, right? A deaf mute, as this person is often identified. What does Jesus do? Notice verse 33. Jesus takes him aside from the crowd privately, put his fingers into his ears and spit and touches his tongue. We talked last week about the kind of the physical details that Mark gives us that the other gospel accounts don't. What I want to remind us is if this happens in private, Jesus escorts the deaf mute out of the vicinity of others so that he can do this thing. There's something private happening. And notice verse 36, Jesus charged them, and I presume that he had some companions with him. Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. Maybe there's an element of purpose that's revealed to us in Mark. The best way to get something spread throughout a community is to tell it as a secret, right? You know this. Don't tell anybody, but how long does it take for that to get around? There's nothing better than a juicy bit of gossip or detail. And I wonder if Mark is telling us what we know to be true, that the more you tell somebody to keep something a secret, the more desperately they want to tell someone. We all know friends like that. And so we just don't tell them, right? Or else the word will get out. But I wonder if the hypothesis that I would offer here is some reverse psychology. That maybe, and people think that maybe the reason Jesus tells people to keep it a secret is because he wants it to spread like wildfire. And there's nothing better to spread the gospel than wildfire. I think there's something interesting about the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. I think there's something interesting there. I don't really buy the reverse psychology hypothesis. I figure that even though I bet secrets were just as hard to keep in Jesus's day as they are today, typically those kind of unspoken or counterintuitive impulses or motives, I just don't think they work in the gospel text. I think if when Jesus says something, we should take him at his word. There's no wink, wink. Inside knowledge, I don't think helps us with the nature of a gospel text. I don't think these were designed to be conveyed in ways that would require you to see the person winking in order to understand it. So because of that, I don't really buy the hidden agenda or the hidden meaning. But there are those who think that it certainly does. It does that. It absolutely spreads like wildfire. And maybe there's a purpose there. I'm curious what you think. Any questions or comments about that approach or that that philosophy. Notice that by the time we get to Mark 7, things are beginning to turn. In Mark 8, as we looked at last week, was when Peter identified Jesus as the Christ, and then consequences begin to unfold. So this is kind of coming right ahead of that miracle, which is what we're going to look at next. So this time, Mark 8, kind of like Mark 4, is not actually a miracle. This is a secret of a different kind, and this is another moment where Jesus is very clear to his followers that he wants them to keep things quiet, to keep things a secret. So we remember, right, that when Jesus is on his way with his disciples, he asks the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they say, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others one of the prophets." Jesus then asked him, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answers, "You are the Christ." And the very next words out of Mark's pen are, Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Isn't that interesting? We've been through 8 chapters of Mark at this point. We're right in the middle of chapter 8, getting close to the end of chapter 8. All the way, every page turn, the disciples are clearly clueless. Several times Jesus gets angry with the disciples for not understanding. Back in chapter 4, if you read the whole chapter, Jesus says, "Do you still not understand what the parable means?" Earlier in chapter 8, the disciples are talking about the bread, the fact that they have no bread in the boat. And Jesus says, "Are you still talking about bread? Don't you understand what I mean by leaven of the Pharisees?" So Jesus is frustrated with the disciples for being clueless. Then out of nowhere, we get the truth, the big confession. This confession is so important that there's a feast day in the church's calendar for it, the confession of St. Peter. But as soon as the word breaks out, what does Jesus say? Don't tell anybody about it. Why? Why is that the case? Well, if we read the rest of the text, right, the rest of this chapter, we're not going to read it. But as soon as he tells them to be quiet about it, he begins to predict his own suffering and death. This is the first time that Jesus says to the disciples, the Son of Man must suffer, be rejected, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This is the first time Jesus tells anybody that he must suffer and die. That is not the kind of Messiah that people are expecting, but it's the kind of Messiah or Christ that God and Jesus have in mind. So unexpected is this that Peter, having identified Jesus as the Christ, forgets himself and begins to rebuke him and elicits from Jesus this stern rebuke, "Get behind me, Satan," right? I preached about that last Sunday. So clearly there's something out of step. So even though Peter understands who Jesus is, he doesn't understand fully who Jesus is. That even though Peter and the disciples have identified Jesus as the Christ, they don't really understand what that Christ means, what that Christ identity means. Jesus predicts his death, and the disciples can't get their heads around it. The next paragraph, I've included it there for us to see. Again, Jesus teaches, whoever would save his life would lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. If you want to follow me, take up your cross. Jesus is very clear and begins to speak openly that following Jesus means to suffer and die. But people can't get their minds around that. And in particular, people don't see Messiah, Christ language associated with suffering and death language. If you are the Messiah, you will not suffer and die. You will be victorious. That's everybody's expectation. It's our expectation too. And yet Jesus lets us know that what it means for him to be the Messiah is to indeed suffer and die. Messiah and Christ are the same word. Messiah is the Aramaic Hebrew word, and Christ is the Greek version, both of which mean anointed or anointed one. So the hypothesis, why keep it a secret? In this case, the hypothesis is because they don't really understand what they're talking about anyway. In particular, when the reason perhaps all along that Jesus has said, keep it a secret, keep it a secret, keep it a secret, is because if the people knew that Jesus was the Messiah, they would automatically expect something of him in his ministry that isn't true to who he is. So he says, keep it a secret until it becomes clear, and it will only become clear after the resurrection. I wonder what you think about that hypothesis. It feels like we're getting closer to at least something that'll stick, something that holds it all together. I don't buy the reverse psychology hypothesis, but I do buy this sense in which Jesus is pushing back against those who don't really understand who he is. I got one more example for you And then we're going to pull all the strands together. You can tell we're moving more quickly because we have a service at 11. So forgive me for moving more quickly and not giving as much time for discussion. But let me read this last example for us. This is the Transfiguration story. We're going to read the whole example for us, and we're going to listen again for language about secret and what that secret might mean. You can tell that I'm going to skip some verses and read a little bit more at the bottom. But let me start with Mark chapter 9, starting at verse 2. This is right after chapter 8, right after Peter's confession, right after Jesus predicts his own death. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, the triumvirate, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, This is my beloved Son, listen to him. And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. Aha. So here we see the secret, keep it a secret. However, the command to keep it a secret is tied to the moment where you don't have to keep it a secret anymore, which is tell no one what you've seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. That which was hidden will come to light. What good is a secret except it would be known? So here we see Jesus revealed in his radiant splendor, and yet telling them, keep this a secret. Don't let anybody know this is who I am until the Son of Man has risen from the dead, at what point it will all become clear. That begins to make more sense to us. The passion prediction, the suffering and death, those things aren't consonant with a typical understanding of who the Messiah is. Yet, after Easter, after the resurrection, we will understand that even though Jesus suffers and dies, he is Messiah, and that Messiahship is clarified in the resurrection. Yes, with me? Notice, we're going to skip a couple of verses, but notice, again, same spirit. They passed through Galilee, and Jesus did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying, the Son of Man is going to be delivered, killed, 3 days rise again, but they didn't understand the saying and were afraid to ask him, right? So why does he not want anybody to know? Because he's still teaching about his upcoming death, and still his disciples don't understand. They were afraid to even ask him, right? Just to let us know that Mark's so clever. People discount Mark for being kind of haphazardly or not as fully written. I think Mark is as rich as any text, and it's amazing how succinctly Mark does it. But Mark stitches these things together on purpose. Don't tell anybody because Jesus is teaching about his suffering. And when they get where they're going back home, back to Capernaum, he said, what were y'all talking about on the way? They didn't want to tell him because they were arguing with each other about who was the greatest. And he calls them and says, whoever would be first must be last and servant of all. Put a child in the midst of them and says, unless whenever you receive a child like this, you receive not me, but the one who sent me, right? So we get this teaching about humility. So again, Mark wants us to know that what they didn't understand is what we still struggle to understand, which is that what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to be humble, to be a servant, that the greatest of all is servant of all. So the hypothesis that I would offer with Peter's confession in the last bit is the confusion of the messianic nature. And I want to expand upon that this time maybe the reason Jesus is telling them to keep it a secret is because not only do they not understand who Jesus is, but they don't understand what their role is. That maybe if you start to think that you're following the one, the Messiah, the Christ, you might think that your job is to puff out your chest and say, I'm on the winning team. But of course, Jesus is shaping us and molding us into a life that is to follow the one who suffers. So what does that all mean? Let me wrap it up together because we got 4 minutes until Dan is going to want to take back over this live stream. So some concluding thoughts. All right, so all of those hypotheses, every one of the hypotheses that I've suggested, depend upon Jesus ordering secrecy. They all ask, why would Jesus have wanted things to be a secret? The last hypothesis I want to suggest, however, asks, what if Jesus isn't the one who did it? What if Jesus historically, this is offering a historical critical approach to the Bible, which may have value, but it might not have value for your faith, and it doesn't just discard it. What if that emphasis on keep it a secret didn't come originally from Jesus, but upon the community who was telling these stories? This is William of Vreda's hypothesis, 1901, a German student of the gospel. His study of the gospel still holds up as one of the most profound texts on the nature of gospel, his text on Mark. But in 1901, over a century ago, he suggested that Jesus wasn't the one who came up with the messianic secret, that instead the Christians who told these stories originally, they were the ones who told the importance of secret as a way to explain why Jesus wasn't hailed as Messiah during his life and only became Messiah after Easter. Think about it. If Jesus really was the Messiah, and if everybody understood him to be Messiah, why don't the history books tell us that? Why isn't there any account other than the gospel that Jesus was Messiah? Why doesn't the conflict that centers on the cross, why isn't that about messianic identity? The gospel narrative doesn't fit that role. Instead, it seems likely that even his disciples didn't really understand what it meant to call Jesus Christ or Messiah until after Easter. And there are threads in the gospel tradition that support that, right? When Peter identifies him and he says, keep it a secret. When he says, don't tell anybody because I want to teach you the nature of my messianic identity. One of the ways that scholars explain the historical accident of Jesus's messianic identity only becoming clear after Easter is to tell the story as if Jesus told them to keep it a secret. What if for the entire of the disciples' time with Jesus, they were still trying to figure it out, trying to figure out this truth that was only ultimately clear when the tomb was found to be empty, when Jesus appeared to the disciples and showed himself as the vindicated one, the one who had been crucified and raised from the dead. That's a pretty clear fulfillment of the messianic expectations of Daniel chapter 7, the one who suffers on behalf of the people and is vindicated through their suffering. Maybe that messianic identity only made sense after the vindication, right? Again, I'm not suggesting that's the ultimate expression, but it does help me kind of get my arms around why ask everybody to keep it a secret. What I want you to pull away from this class is, interestingly enough, Matthew and Luke and John have tiny seeds of the secret, but only remnants where they seem to be quoting Mark or incorporating a story from Mark. Matthew and Luke aren't nearly as interested, neither is John, interested in this messianic secret as Mark is. So something's going on in Mark's proclaiming the gospel. Something's going on in Mark's community that make this concept of messianic secret important. Not as important in the other gospel accounts. I wonder why. I wonder what that tells us about God and about Jesus and the nature of his ministry. Well, I'm glad you've been with us. Thank you. We've got 10 minutes until the service starts. Appreciate y'all's patience and let us fly through this. If you've got questions or comments, share them. I won't be able to see them on the Q&A, but share them with me by email. Reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Next week, we will look at another aspect of Only Mark, and I hope you'll be with us. Let's finish our time today by praying together the prayer that Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you all very much. Hope you all have a great day.